Welcome everyone to the webinar on abrasive weeding, efficacy, multifunctionality, and profitability. In this webinar, members of a NIFA-funded research team will present results from over 3 years of research and development of this weed management technique. They will be discussing opportunities for maximizing weed control, crop nutrition and yield, and profitability with abrasive weeding. This is your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. On our website at extension.org/organic_production, you can find many free articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research. So I'd like to just give you a very quick orientation on how today's webinar will work. The presenters will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions. We'll be reading the questions out loud, and we will answer as many as we have time for. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome back Sam Wortman of the University of Nebraska, who will be joined by Daniel Humberg of South Dakota State University. They worked together with other team members, Frank Forcella and Sharon Clay, on an article, which was on the previous link, which also has a video about abrasive weeding, which is on the eExtension website. So without any further ado, Sam, you can unmute your microphone, and I'm going to hand you over the control of the slides.
Well, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to excited to share with you the some of the progress that we've made over the last few years on this USDA NIFA OREI project. And so just want to acknowledge Daniel Umberg, Professor Emeritus from South Dakota State University. He'll be presenting towards the end here today about some commercialization and engineering considerations for grit applicators. And then while they're not on the webinar today, I definitely want to acknowledge contributors to all of this content. Frank Forcella, who is kind of the original brains behind this operation. He's been working on abrasive weeding in one form or another for pretty close to a decade now, back when I was still in graduate school. So I really appreciate all of Frank's contributions to the project. Sharon Clay at South Dakota State has been a great collaborator. She advised Michael Carlson. Her and Frank advised Michael Carlson, a master's student who successfully finished at South Dakota State. And then we've also got contributions from Emily Braun, who successfully finished a master's at the University of Illinois last year. So quick overview of what we'll cover in the webinar today. I'll give you just a very brief introduction to the project in case this is your first exposure to this concept of abrasive weeding. But as Alice mentioned, we've got an extension article and YouTube video that gives a good primer on abrasive weeding. And then we'll go into some examples of how we've tested efficacy in corn and soybean crops, red pepper, and then where we were mostly looking at annual weeds in those systems. We've also got some data to where we looked at efficacy on a perennial weed, quackgrass. And then we'll get into multifunctionality. And this was kind of a big focus of this grant, was to assess whether or not we could use organic fertilizer grits to integrate nutrient and weed management. A lot of the early work leading up to this grant, we were looking at agricultural grits like corn cob grits and walnut shells, and we had good success with those. And so a big focus of this project was, can we use a multifunctional grit, and to what degree is it providing some of those extra benefits? So we'll talk about that. And then the big question that we always get from growers, understandably, is this method going to be profitable for organic growers? And so we've got some analyses of different scenarios and crops that I'll share with you today. And then I'll turn it over to Dan Umberg, who will talk about some options for commercializing the grit applicator technology. And then we'll wrap up with some of the big take-home messages that we've learned over the last few years. Excuse me. So kind of a two-slide, real quick overview of why abrasive weeding. No surprise to most of you, I'm sure, that weeds are a top management concern for organic farmers. And despite that concern, we still have relatively few options, at least relatively not a lot of great options. So there are organic herbicides commercially available, but most of them are fairly expensive and still have fairly low efficacy compared to other weed control methods. So at least on a large scale, it's not most of them are not great options. Flame weeding is really popular amongst organic growers, and with good reason in some situations, although when we're looking for in-row weed control, a lot of studies document some crop injury and reduced stands, which would lead to reduced yield. So if we're looking at in-row weed control, flame weeding isn't always the best option, depending on the crop and the growth stage. Tillage is also a very popular method of weed control in organic systems, but like flame weeding, if you're using something like a rotary hoe, that can injure crop and reduce stands as well. So we often have to overseed, which is an added expense. And then, of course, lots of repeated tillage has some negative soil health consequences. So we're looking for methods that are a little bit less intensive in terms of soil disturbance. And at least for vegetable growers and fruit growers, hand weeding is a very popular and common form of weed control. And the problem there is that it's expensive and often difficult to source, and so can be unreliable. And so if there's ways that we can manage these weeds by reducing our dependence on human labor, then that can be an advantage. And so ultimately our goal is to find cost-effective, crop-safe, and reduced labor options for weed control in organic systems. And so we see abrasive weeding as something that fills some of these niches. And abrasive weeding generally is just the use of an air-propelled grit to destroy any above-ground weed tissue. And so these grits are moving, they're being, I guess, propelled by about 700 kilopascals of compressed air. So we're typically setting an air compressor at between 90 and 140 psi. And that's going to accelerate really any gritty material. Again, we started out testing things like corn cob and walnut shells, but we've expanded to look at sands and organic fertilizers, any gritty material. We've looked at coffee grounds, lots of different possibilities. And so really any gritty material. And the goal is that that grit will then shred and hopefully destroy stems, leaves, and meristems of weeds, but not the crop. And so we're looking for a little bit of a size differential between the crop and the weed to make sure that the crop is not injured or destroyed by these grits. And so this is really an in-row or spot application tool to be combined with between-row tactics. And we'll get into some of the economics of this later, but it wouldn't, under most circumstances, this would not be a cost-effective tool for like a broadcast pre-plant type of weed control method. It's more of a spot spray or maybe a 4 to 6 inch band within the crop row, which are often the most difficult weeds to control in organic systems. So this picture on the right here just gives you an idea of what, kind of what we're accomplishing here. This was a kind of a rigged up apparatus that we developed while I was at the University of Illinois to do some greenhouse testing. And so you can see here's a hopper of some corncob grit and a funnel, and then we've got our abrasive grit gun. Here's our air compressor. And we would put weeds into this little chamber here and test different grits and different rates of grits. And you can see an example of that if you check out the YouTube video. All right, so building on work that started in the late 2000s and into the early kind of 2010, 11, 12, Frank and Sharon, along with Dan, developed some good research to kind of show this proof of concept even in the field of abrasive weeding in corn and soybean. And it was that work, and then I teamed up with them, and we put in for this OREI project and got funded for 4 years starting in 2014. And we had about 8 objectives, but I want to focus on 5 of those today. And so the objectives that I'll focus on today are the first being that we set out to design and pilot an abrasive grit applicator specifically for vegetable production. Prior to this project, Dan had already prototyped and engineered a 4-row applicator for row crops, and so I was interested in something that was a little bit more adaptable for the typical diversified vegetable grower. And then, excuse me, our second objective was to assess efficacy of abrasive grits for in-row weed control in both grain and vegetable crops. So a lot of what we've been doing before, but now we were looking at a wider range of possible grit sources, including those organic fertilizers. And so our third objective was to see if those organic fertilizers that we were testing for weed control could they actually provide some measurable nitrogen value in the soil and ultimately to the crop? And then our fourth objective, to determine compatibility of abrasive weeding with other between-row weed management options. So this was kind of specific to vegetable crops, so a lot of intensive vegetable production includes the use of, say, a plastic film mulch, or maybe a straw mulch or a biodegradable mulch. And so we wanted to know whether or not abrasive weeding could supplement that typical weed control method, just logistically in terms of potential damage to the mulches, and then also from a weed efficacy standpoint as well. And then our last thing was to run some profitability analyses on these different scenarios. Okay, so I'll start by talking about some of the data that was collected by Sharon and Michael in South Dakota, and also Frank in Minnesota over the last few years. And so again, that research over the last few years in South Dakota and Minnesota was really an extension of what they had been doing, but now was including some of these organic fertilizer grits. So they had about 10 site years of data across corn and soybeans from 3 locations. And in each site year, they had a variety of different treatments. But what I'll share with you today is kind of a pooled analysis across common treatments. And so basically all of their plots received inter-row cultivation as kind of a supplemental standard weed management strategy in organic grain crops. But then they also added with or without an in-row grit treatment. So basically just inter-row cultivation alone or inter-row cultivation with grit treatment. And for the purposes of the pooled analysis, we're just going to look at Sustain, which is an 824 fertilizer that is made from a composted turkey litter. This is a company out of Cannon Falls, Minnesota. And then our second product was an Agri-Grit, which is just a granulated walnut shell that comes out of California. And both of those are allowed in certified organic systems, and so that was part of the reason that we chose those as potential inputs in this grit applicator. And then we had weedy and weed-free controls. So the grits were applied at V1 and V5 growth stages in corn, so 1 or 5 leaves, and then in V1 and V3, so that's the first fully emerged trifoliate, and then 3 fully emerged trifoliate leaves in soybean. Data that was collected included, at least in maize, they collected maize leaf greenness in 2016 and 2017 across site years. And then in all of these site years, they looked at in and also between row weed density and biomass during the reproductive stages of corn and soybean growth. And then they measured grain yield. So weed control overall across these 10 site years in corn and soybean was relatively weak. And a lot of this can be attributed to poor timing. And not that that's necessarily our team's fault, but as you know, it can be challenging to apply weed control practices in a timely manner. Whether you're using chemicals or physical methods, the timing is often very important. And if you've ever used a rotary hoe, you know how important the timing can be with practices like that. And so what they found was that most weeds were controlled at the V1 stage in corn. So if they got out and applied grits at the V1 stage, most of those seedlings were killed. But if they waited until V1 in soybean, they found a far lower efficacy. So the weeds were already 2 to 6 centimeters tall, or 1 to 3 inches. And in those cases, they found that weed density was sometimes in the worst case scenario, when the weeds were relatively tall, they saw very little reduction in weed density, or maybe up to 50%. And then when they waited until that second application at V3 in soybean or V5 in corn, at that point, any of the weed escapes from the first application or any new weeds that had emerged since that first application were all at least 4 centimeters tall. And by that point, it was difficult to completely remove or kill the weed, and instead they were just damaging those weeds. And so they may have stunted those weeds, but they didn't reduce any density, and so the weeds had the potential to recover and continue to compete with the crop. And these are some pictures that I took from some of our early work at the University of Illinois, and you can see how important growth stage is in terms of the weeds. And so in the top picture, this is a planting hole in tomato, where the weeds were definitely greater than 4 centimeters tall. Most of them had 2 or 3 leaves on them. And when we applied grits in those, we did considerable damage to the weeds, but we hadn't removed them. So they were kind of wilted, and some of them may have died, but some of them definitely regrew. Whereas when I don't have an after picture here, but this is the before picture when we applied grits in 2013 into a pepper crop here on the bottom, and most of those are less than 1 inch tall, so they're kind of at the cotyledon or one leaf stage, and in those cases we get pretty close to 100% efficacy, and so that timing becomes really critical. And so a big lesson that we learned here is that grit application timing should really be based on weed growth stage, and ideally cotyledon or one leaf, and not necessarily on the crop growth stage, which is a challenge in some row crops because, again, one of the factors necessary for success with grit application is that you have the size differential between your cash crop and your weeds. And so that was some of the justification for timing this based on V1, V3, V5, was that we wanted to make sure we had that size differential. But as you know, sometimes, depending on rainfall and soil temperature, sometimes the weeds can take off faster than the crop. And so those would be problematic situations in a corn-soybean type of system. Now, looking at the yield data, kind of interesting. So even though we didn't get great weed control from abrasive weeding in these plots of corn and soybean, we did find that in-row grit treatment still did increase corn yield. Not with soybean, but corn yields were increased relative to the unweeded check. So when we used sustained fertilizer, that 824 product, that increased yield relative to the weedy check by 44%, and then those aggregates increased yield 14%, and then on average those yields were about 10% lower than the hand-weeded season-long weed-free control. So we couldn't quite get to that threshold, but definitely an improvement upon the unweeded check. And what's interesting is that the yield gains in the sustained treatment seem to be possibly due to the fertilizer value from that grit. So leaf greenness was 44% greater than in the weedy check. So that would suggest, leaf greenness, an indirect measure of chlorophyll content, which is often very well correlated to nitrogen content or leaf tissue N, and which is of course related to soil N. And so it's possible that that increase in leaf greenness was associated with increased soil nitrogen nutrition and nitrogen uptake in the plant. Now, what's also kind of odd or interesting is that greenness following application of that walnut shell grit also increased leaf greenness compared to the weedy check, which, despite the fact that weed biomass was similar across grit weeded and not grit weeded, there must have been some reduction in weed competition that led to greater plant health and greenness in the corn, because the walnut shell grit does not have any nutritional value. It's almost an entirely pure carbon substrate, and so we wouldn't expect, if anything, we'd expect nitrogen immobilization, but that at least temporary suppression of weeds may have improved crop health. Now, again, most of the weeds that we were trying to control in those systems were usually annual broadleaves, but sometimes a good mix of annual grasses as well. But many growers struggle with perennial weeds, and so the question is abrasive weeding effective at all on perennial weeds? And based on what I just showed you in terms of how important the size of the weed is at the time of application, in many cases when a perennial weed becomes well established, it's going to be difficult. But if we can make applications when a perennial weed is still small, we can make headway. And the figures on this slide are from a paper that we just published in the Canadian Journal of Plant Science, and work that Frank Forcella did in Minnesota. And he showed that defoliation, while sometimes can be discouraging when you don't completely obliterate the weed with the grits, it can still be effective. And so what we observed with crackgrass, which is a perennial or rhizomatous grass, was that 2 applications spaced a week apart were enough to basically exhaust the energy reserves from those below ground meristematic tissues, and that limited regrowth 5 weeks after application. And you can see that number of culms, above ground weight, and also below ground weight drops off significantly once we go to 2 applications. And these were 3-second applications, which is a little bit longer than we would typically see in the field. Nonetheless, if you're looking at a spot spray treatment, this could be quite effective. And so it is possible to control those perennial weeds, but it does take repeated applications and sometimes longer duration of application. Okay, and now I want to talk about the work that my master's student Emily Braun did at the University of Illinois. And this project, she was looking at whether or not we could use those fertilizer grits to suppress weeds and also contribute some soil nitrogen in a organic red pepper system. So these trials were conducted in 2015 and 16 in Urbana, Illinois. And we looked at 3 different grit sources: walnut shells, a soybean meal fertilizer, which was, I think, Phytogrow Leafy Green from California Organic Fertilizers. It's a 712 analysis. And then that same Sustain 824 product. And we had season-long weedy checks and weed-free checks. And then again, one of our objectives was to look at compatibility with these common mulch options in organic vegetable production. So we had a straw mulch, which was a ground-up miscanthus straw mulch. We have at the University of Illinois a big bioenergy project, and so we had a lot of availability of that particular straw, so that's what we used. And then we used a biodegradable plastic, a commercially available bioplastic. I believe it was a Bio 360 product, and then just a standard polyethylene plastic film. And then we did have a bare soil check as well there. So methods from this study: abrasive grits were applied roughly 10 and 30 days after transplanting. Now, with transplants, we had the advantage that we didn't really have to apply based on crop growth stage, because the day that these transplanted peppers go into the ground, they're already large enough that to handle the grit application. We can aim the grits right here at the base of the stem with very minimal damage to the plant, to the crop plant. And so we had the luxury of basing our application timing on the size of the weeds. And so it usually worked out that 10 days after transplanting, we got a flush of weeds that looked like this in the top right. And so we would make our first application, and then we would wait, and sometime around probably about 24 to 30 days is when we'd see a second flush of weeds like this, and we would make our second and final application. Now, we used something called a plant root simulator probe to measure nitrogen availability continuously in soil. These are passive ion exchange membranes that, in theory, kind of act like a root in soil. And so we didn't isolate those probes, so in a sense, they were competing with nutrients, competing with the crop for nutrients, and we put those directly in the planting hole. You can see one of our students installing those right next to one of these pepper plants. And we collected in and between row weed density 1 and 2 months after transplanting, and also weed biomass, and then we looked at yields of peppers. All right, so we'll start with looking at this question of, were we getting any increases in measurable soil nitrogen from the organic fertilizer grits? The answer was generally yes. Available nitrogen tended to increase up to as much as 30%, but only when grits were combined with film mulches. And so if we'll start by looking at the bioplastics, we've got these grouped here into weed-free control, the soybean meal grit, and the turkey litter grit. And total N, which is mostly nitrate, a little bit of ammonium. So mostly nitrates. These are an average of the 2-week incubation intervals over the course of 8 weeks during the season. And we found that in the weed-free control, where no grits were applied in bioplastic, we had about 153, and these are kind of obscure units, but it's micrograms. And then we had 200 micrograms of nitrogen in the bioplastic with soybean meal, and then slightly higher with turkey litter. And then we saw a similar trend for polyethylene plastic, lowest in the weed-free, slightly higher in soybean meal and turkey litter. So you'll notice that we didn't see those trends with bare soil and straw mulch, and part of that is simply due to intense weed competition in those systems. And so with more plants, whether it's weeds or crops growing out there, we saw actually a reduction in some cases in nitrogen. And then with straw mulch, we saw some immobilization of nitrogen because of the high carbon content. So that's why I've focused here on the bioplastic and polyethylene, because it helps us to kind of isolate the effects of the grits. So consistent with what we'd been finding in some of our early work in tomato and pepper, we were finding a pretty consistently solid level of weed control when we paired abrasive weeding with film mulches, whether it was plastic or bioplastic. And we found that in-row weed density and biomass was typically reduced up to 90% compared to that weedy check. So I've highlighted here the middle portion again to focus on bioplastic and polyethylene systems. And the top here in each one is the weedy control. So for example, at 30 days after grit treatment, we had 20 weeds per plot, and then soybean meal reduced that down to 9, turkey litter down to 6.5. And then you can see by 60 days, a lot of those weeds got shaded out, and we had some mortality, so that dropped off, but a similar level of reduction, especially with walnut shell. Now, the weed biomass is an interesting story because if you look at weed biomass in bare soil, the weedy control had 624 grams per meter squared. And then you look at bioplastic and polyethylene, and we actually see this huge spike, almost a doubling or a tripling of weed biomass on a per area basis in bioplastic and polyethylene. And we chalk that up to the fact that, you know, the reason growers like these plastic films is they help to intensify production. They raise soil temperatures, they suppress weeds, they conserve soil moisture. So it's a great environment for plant growth, both crops and weeds. And so we're seeing this explosion of weed biomass in the planting holes of bioplastic and polyethylene. And what's important to note is that when you look at weed biomass levels in soybean meal, turkey litter, walnut shell of bioplastic and polyethylene, they're not too different from the bare soil control, but relative to the control in each of these treatments, they're doing a good job, roughly on that 90% level of reducing that biomass. And so it's really, I guess, one of the take-home messages that we'll get at today is that the weeds that come through those planting holes, while it's a relatively small area of the total field, can have very severe yield consequences in organic vegetable production, and abrasive weeding was effective for reducing those weeds. Looking at the yields, this is across 2 years. We found that grits and mulch film together helped to increase marketable yield up to 66% compared to the weedy check. Now, what was a little bit disappointing was that we weren't able to get to those weed-free yields with grit weeding paired with mulch films like we had in the past. Some of our early work that I presented in our first webinar, we showed that yields were fairly comparable between the weed-free control and our grit treatments, and we didn't quite achieve that in the 2 years of this study. But we did get significant increases relative to that weedy check. And so you can see, again, focusing on the bioplastic and polyethylene, the general increase that we get with our 3 different types of grit compared to the weedy check. And then I want to point your attention to the bare soil, because this is a scenario where there was no supplemental weed control in terms of a plastic or a straw mulch. And so the only weed control we had was grits in the crop row. And you can see that really that does not help to increase yields at all. All of the yields were fairly dismal and not different from the weedy control. So the take-home message here is that grit weeding or abrasive weeding alone is not a sufficient form of weed control. It should be used as a supplement to, say, inter-row cultivation or some type of a mulch system if you're dealing with vegetables. So getting back to this this original question of whether or not, excuse me, let me mute real quick. Okay, so getting back to this original question of whether or not abrasive weeding is compatible with plastic and bioplastic films or straw mulch, from a logistical perspective, it does not work very well with straw mulch. So we had a lot of problems with straw mulch in the study, the biggest being immobilization of nitrogen. So we saw reduced yields in general because of low nitrogen. But from, even if you ignore that problem, one issue is that when we're propelling these grits at close to 700 kilopascals or 130 psi, in addition with the weeds blowing away, a lot of that mulch blows away too, which kind of defeats the purpose of the grit application, because you're removing your mulch from the bed top as you spray your grits. And so just not a real logistical fit between straw mulch and abrasive weeding. So wouldn't recommend that. But if we look at plastic and bioplastic films, certainly the plastic films are a little bit more durable and can handle a little bit of damage from the grit. They're not completely obliterated by abrasive grits, at least 1 or 2 applications that we were making, although the bioplastics are a little bit more susceptible to being punctured or torn from the grit application. Now, some of this comes down to how you apply it. If you watch the video that we have on YouTube, you'll see that because the technology isn't quite where we need it to be, and we're still developing it, we at this point only have the capacity to either apply it with a hand trigger or just a continuous application. And so in some of the videos, you'll see that we just leave the grit applicator on as we move through a plastic bed top. And so the plastic gets sprayed along with the planting hole. And in the video, you'll see that the plastic kind of gets a little bit damaged, but it doesn't get shredded. That's not an ideal scenario. We'd rather pulse that application so that some of it is most of the grit is actually going into the planting hole, and then it turns off when it's on the plastic. So that's kind of on our wish list of future changes to the grit applicators. But if you're making a hand application, as we did in most of our research trials, that's not an issue, because the plastic does okay when you're making that grit application by hand. So okay, so now looking at the actual performance, so getting away from the logistics and just looking at the data, as far as in-row weed density, now without grit weeding, plastic and bioplastic alone reduced weeds 86%, and that's not surprising. I mean, you've eliminated most of the weeds that could come up between plants, so that's good. Now, abrasive weeding alone, remember we just looked at the yields, and abrasive weeding alone did nothing for yields, but it did reduce weeds 35%. So not a complete waste of time, but not great. Now, there does, when we combine those two, we get a 94 to 98% reduction in weed density. So not really a synergistic benefit, but there is some additive benefit there of combining these two tactics. And then when we look at weed biomass, as I talked about, films seem to be stimulating weed growth and biomass along with the crop, which is why we use them. But abrasive weeding helped us to cut back that increase in biomass by up to 87% in those films. And then what's interesting is if you look at the yields and you break it down by with and without abrasive weeding in films, films alone, obviously effective compared to that bare soil weedy check, we're getting a 6-fold increase in yield. Abrasive weeding alone, as I just mentioned, has no effect on yield, but when we combine the two, we can get an 8-fold increase in yield. And so while abrasive weeding alone is not enough to increase vegetable yields, when you combine it with one of those plastic or bioplastic films, we do see this synergistic increase in yield, which is exciting. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first couple of years that we were working in vegetables, we saw fairly similar yields between the weed-free check and our grit-treated plots. And so we were a little bit surprised by our first year of data where we saw this drop in yield a little bit, especially because we were looking at organic fertilizers. We thought, well, heck, if we can get sufficient weed control in these systems and we can get a little bit of additional nitrogen, there shouldn't be any reason we can't exceed the yields in those weed-free treatments. And so we wanted to look a little bit deeper into this idea of grits as a fertilizer source. So we did some controlled experiments. And the first of those controlled experiments was an incubation. And we looked at soil ammonium and nitrate, and we found that ammonium was increased 6-fold by about 1 to 2 weeks after application, and nitrate nearly doubled after that initial grit application by about 3 to 4 weeks after application. So certainly in an incubation, these things like sustain, soybean meal, and even corn gluten meal are acting pretty rapidly as fertilizers. And so from there, we did a greenhouse study to determine if these gains in soil nitrogen could be enough to increase kale yield. It was the crop that we tested in the greenhouse. And this was a 2-year experiment. And what was unique about this was that we just dropped the grits into the pots. We didn't actually blast them because, again, we wanted to make sure that the grits stayed there next to the crop, and we wanted to eliminate any potential abrasion to the crop. And so we had 2 rates that was 50 and 100%. These percentages correspond to what comes out of the nozzle and how much of what comes out of the nozzle we assume to stay in that crop root zone. And so with 100%, all of it was left there. And then 50%, it's this idea that maybe half of what we actually apply bounces off the soil surface and across the mulch and out of the crop rooting zone, maybe into the alleyway. So that's why we tested 2 rates. And we were using, again, sustain and soybean meal, and then we included walnut shell and then no application. And then we were curious whether or not a soil incorporation, like a simulated tillage, might help to release some of that nitrogen and maximize the value And so we took soil samples every couple weeks and looked at mineral nitrogen in the soil. We looked at leaf greenness as a proxy for nitrogen uptake, and also looked at some tissue N analyses and harvested those kale leaves. And what we found was that fertilizer grits did increase leaf tissue nitrogen within about a month. So your control is over here, 3% tissue N in those kale leaves. And then that if 100% of those grits stay in the crop rooting zone, the leaf tissue N jumped to 4.5%. Similar levels around 4.25 for soybean meal low and turkey high. And strangely, the walnut shells again jumped to about 3.6, 3.7, which can't really explain that again because that's almost entirely carbon. And most importantly, the fertilizer grits helped us to increase kale yield across both years. So you can see similar levels correspond pretty well to those tissue N levels. So going back to tissue N, and then this is fresh weight of those kale leaves, marketable leaves. And from the control to soybean high and turkey high, we go from 60 to 80. So roughly a 30% increase in kale yield when we just put 100% of what leaves the nozzle in the crop rooting zone. So this was great. Fertilizer grits seemed to be able to control weeds. We documented that, at least in certain vegetable crops. We can increase soil and tissue N. We showed that under controlled environmental conditions, and we showed that kale yield was increased, even beyond that check. But again, a lot of this was done under controlled conditions. And so this past year, 2017, we designed another field experiment in Urbana in both pepper and broccoli, with and without compost. But this time we took 2 organic fertilizers, an 824 sustained product versus a 374 sustained product. And we did this because we wanted to see if we could manipulate basically soil nitrogen levels by using the same product but with just a different nitrogen analysis. And then we've manipulated the rate, 3 versus 6 passes. The 6 passes were not 6 different intervals, 3 passes at one interval, at each interval rather, and this was with a single nozzle. And these results were pretty exciting, at least in pepper. We didn't see as much effects on broccoli, and there's some reasons for that I won't go into in the interest of time, but the pepper results were exciting in that it does seem that we were able to successfully manipulate soil nitrogen and eventually yield with the use of these different grits and application rates. So looking at this figure on our right, the weed-free yields, unfortunately, were still the highest, but we came close to getting back to those weed-free, hand-weeded yields. With our high rate of the 824 product, we saw our second best yields. And then the high rate of the 374, we also saw relatively high yields. And what was interesting was that pepper yield tended to increase with the concentration of N in the product we applied, and then also with the grit rate. So within a product, increasing the rate increased the yield, and then the 8% product was consistently greater than the 3% product. And so this is encouraging that we could potentially use our grit applicators as a way to deliver predictable amounts of fertilizer that have measurable effects on yield. All right, and then I do want to just take a few minutes to walk through the profitability of abrasive weeding for some of these different scenarios that I just talked about. So a few things about the methods that we use to look at profitability. So crop revenue is a difficult thing to incorporate into these analyses, and that's in part because it varies so widely depending on the market. So obviously wholesale markets versus retail can bring very different prices, especially when you're talking about vegetables. So we used a mix of USDA statistics and also farmers market prices and grocery store prices to come up with a fairly broad range of possible crop revenues. And then costs included range of possibly hourly wages, tractor use, ownership costs for the grit applicator, which I'll talk about here briefly. Abrasive grits, bulk versus retail was another big variation in this analysis. When you talk about abrasive grits at the retail scale, it's much more expensive than if you're buying 20 tons of a grit or if you're, say, producing grit on farm. And then we also included fuel estimates. Now, when it comes to the grit applicator, ownership assumes an interest rate or an opportunity cost between 2 to 5% annually, a useful life of 20 years, and then the retail purchase price of a grit applicator, which is somewhat of a challenge because these are not available at a retail scale right now. But talked with Dan, and he kind of gave me some estimates of what the parts cost him to build these 3 different applicators that I'll talk about in this analysis. The 8 nozzle that they used in corn and soybean, parts cost a little over $10,000, and so he estimated that a reasonable retail price for that from a dealer, for example, might be $18,500. And then you see as you go down in the number of nozzles and the size of the air compressor, it becomes far less expensive. So the single nozzle handheld applicator that we used in some of this research might retail for $3,500. And in all these cases, a lot of the expense is tied up in the air compressor, and Dan will talk more about that here briefly. Okay, so quickly looking at the analysis, I'm glad that these webinars are archived because I won't have time to go through all these different numbers, but if you want to look at the YouTube video later, you can pause it and you can look closely at some of these estimates that we used. But you'll notice we've got a range for all of these revenues and expenses, and that's again because there's uncertainty, especially when it comes to what you're selling your crop for, how much you pay your employees, what you're paying for fuel in a given year. So we did our best to come up with a range for some of those possible expenses. So what were the take-home messages from these analyses? We found that weed-free, hand-weeded tomato crop was more profitable than 2 grit applications. But the caveat is that hand weeding required 5 times more labor. And so the bottom line here, which is an average or a net income mean in terms of dollars per hectare, was slightly greater for weed-free relative to hand-weeded. And I'll focus on this first and third column because this is the data that we have. The second and fourth column are hypothetical scenarios that I probably won't have time to get into today. But if you compare that hand-weeded check to how we applied grits, the potential increase in average net income was $32,000 per hectare if you hand weed that crop relative to a weedy check, and it was $29,000 per hectare if you're using that handheld applicator. So comparable, both a great increase in overall income, but a little bit better. And the key takeaway here is that if you look at wages, far fewer wages being paid for the handheld applicator. And as I mentioned, labor can be difficult to source, retain, manage. And so if you're looking to cut back on the amount of labor on your farm, even though it's not quite as profitable, it may be a viable option in the absence of labor. Similar story for green pepper, and I'll point out that this data is from the yield data that I presented in the first webinar and is now published in Crop Protection. So for green pepper, revenue gains for weed control were somewhat reduced, so this bottom line's a little bit lower, in part due to a lower crop value. So if you look at the sale price for green pepper relative to a slicing tomato, it's not quite as high. And then also we didn't see as much of a yield increase, and part of that is because, for one, the tomatoes did a better job of outcompeting the weeds. And then the other thing is that we just had higher weed density in the tomatoes, so the overall potential to increase yields relative to a weedy check was better than in pepper. So your initial weed density plays a big role in how much yield you can save and how profitable abrasive weeding is, in addition to the overall value of the crop that you're trying to save. And so still profitable, and a similar discrepancy between handheld grit applicator and hand weeding, but again, notice the big difference in wages that are paid for grit applicator versus hand weeding. And then this red pepper data is from Emily Braun's thesis, the yield data from there. Now this one, you'll see an even bigger discrepancy between that handheld applicator and the weed-free conditions, and most of that is due to the fact that we saw a huge yield increase, the biggest that we had seen, or yield discrepancy rather, between the weed-free and the weedy check. And that again goes back to just the intense weed pressure that we had on this particular farm. And so this really demonstrates the urgency of eliminating in-row weeds, or those in-hole weeds in vegetables that have a particular mulch. Whether you're using grits, whether you're hand weeding, whatever you're doing, an organic herbicide maybe, this really just highlights how much revenue and income can be lost if we don't control those in-row weeds in a crop like red pepper. Okay, and then the last analysis that I'll share with you is in corn. And the take home for corn was that it really was only profitable to use abrasive weeding under the most optimistic scenarios. But the caveat there is that hand weeding is not really an option when you are looking at the scale of corn and soybean production, at least based on the sale prices and the yield increases that we were seeing between weed-free and hand-weeded. Now, I know certainly those crops can be hand-weeded, and many people do that, but the overall margins are a little bit slimmer than what you might realize in something like organic red peppers and paying somebody to hand-weed that crop. And so if you just look at the upper range of net income here, we see some possibility for increased income as a result of handheld application, or this actually should say 4-row application, I apologize. But in most scenarios, we're looking at a reduction in overall income. So before I pass it over to Dan here, some considerations for maximizing profitability of abrasive weeding. Yield response varies by crop, but mostly by weed density. So that initial weed density is really important. If we take a high value crop like organic red peppers and it's in a really weedy field, you use a little bit of blasting in combination with your mulch, and that's a good scenario for increasing profitability. Now, if we want to reduce those costs, which the two biggest costs are grits and applicator, with grits, we can source bulk grits, which helps to lower costs. You definitely don't want to buy grits at retail. And there's also a possibility of producing grits on farm. If you can grind your own grits, that's obviously going to be the least expensive option. And if organic grit has fertilizer value, there may be some merit to looking beyond a 1-year economic analysis, which we didn't do here. And then as far as the grit applicator, there may be possibilities to explore cooperative ownership of an applicator. And overall, I think it's important to think about your scale when you think about the applicator that's right for you, because if we increase the number of acres that we're farming, we typically, to a point, reduce the cost of ownership. So this was just a quick figure that I put together that shows hand weeding. This is for that tomato scenario. This is a single handheld applicator, and then this line is the 2-row applicator that Dan built. And because of the expense of the 1-row versus the 2-row applicator, we optimize the investment or that cost of ownership when we start to hit about 5 to 6 hectares of production with the 2-row applicator, and about 2 hectares when we're using that handheld applicator. So it's important to think about your scale when you're thinking about investing in a grit applicator. Okay, and Alice, if you can switch over to Dan now, he'll talk a little bit about some of the commercialization options.
Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Dan here.
Thank you.
All right, just a second. All right, you should have control now.
Okay. Well, I volunteered to be a part of this for Sam because I knew there probably would be questions about the machines themselves, and occasionally somebody who's maybe interested in trying some aspect of this themselves. So I thought I could provide some information on the machines that we built to date, and I'm actually building a couple more right now, and we might talk briefly about them, and then what we see as at least a potential if somebody wants to try some aspect of what Sam's talked about in the previous part of the presentation. Let's see, there we go. Sam told you this before, and you may have read it or may have know this from earlier presentations that have been given. The first machine we built for Frank Forcella was a 4-row field machine. He was looking at primarily corn organically produced that he was looking to help with. That machine is the largest, clearly, of the ones that we've done. It has 8 nozzles on it, and it has a PTO-driven screw compressor, and that compressor itself costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $9,000 a retail price on the compressor. So anybody building a large machine like that, the compressor is kind of the dominant part of what your cost structure is going to be for the machine. We did a second generation. This is the one we built initially for Sam on his grant. This one also uses a screw compressor, but rather than a large PTO-driven compressor, it's a gas engine-driven compressor that costs probably half as much as the PTO-driven one that we used in the first machine. And this one can handle at least 2 nozzles. It can provide enough air to continuously operate 2 nozzles. And we built it on a cart so that he'd have flexibility to try different things in terms of driving in the field alongside a row to continuously blast. And then we had we were efficient enough on that one that we had some leftover time and funds, and I had a group of students design a third machine, the one shown in the lower right-hand corner, and that was built as kind of a research tool for the guys to be able to use a single nozzle hand applicator wand to do tests with or clean up with or whatever they wanted to experiment with. That one it uses a small contractor scale air compressor, the kind that your building crew might use to run air nailers. It's probably underpowered in terms of the air that it can supply. I don't really believe that it can supply enough air to run that wand continuously. You may have to stop and wait a while for it to recharge before you really have the blast velocities that you want to control weeds. But it was a first attempt at that kind of a pull it along yourself and then operate the wand scale. And I had a group of mechanical engineering students design and build that one. I ended up doing some of the finishing work on it to get it put together and some of the problems worked out of it. And it functions, but it isn't one that I would want to market to anybody at this point. The machines that I'm building currently are for the University of Minnesota for a research project that they have. And they are much like this third one, but with a larger air compressor. Almost twice the capacity of the compressor that's on this cart. And so my anticipation is that we'll be able to operate one wand continuously with that compressor. And so you could either operate it by pulling the cart along and treating spot spraying or spot blasting spots, or you could potentially hook that cart up, and it's designed to have the handle switches around on the new one so that you could connect it to a small garden tractor or something like that if you wanted to ride and pull this behind you and then do spot spraying that way, or mount a nozzle so that you could continuously blast along a row of crop as well. The fourth system this one that I was just talking about is also designed to be kind of a modular grit subsystem as a part of it. If you look at the front part of the cart in the lower diagram there, this is kind of what I would call the grit module on this one. It has a hopper, it has a metering system underneath it, it has a DC motor control and a DC motor that the ME students put together, not as a commercially practicable system. But this module is the part that handles all of the grit, and then there are air hoses, and we've got a wand that's developed that's based on a pressure washer wand for the valve and stuff in it, but it's modified from that. And then you have the cart and the air compressor. But this subsystem is what makes that would make us a module that could be repeated easily. For that system, one of the things that makes it possible is to have a hopper, and this is one of the things that I'm building now that will handle the grid itself, but also provide a platform for mounting the controls on and for mounting the hose connections for your wand. There's a metering block that bolts onto that hopper system that manages as a little rotary meter that we build in it that manages the grit flow rate so that you can control that, increase or vary the flow rate of the grit to suit your application. There's a DC motor and a controller to run that so that you have essentially a dial that controls the duty cycle on a DC motor that will control that metering or flow rate. And then we have the air nozzle and grit entrainment components that are added to this modified pressure washer gun that allow this to function the way that our experience has dictated, I guess. What you see in this diagram is the entrainment point of the grit, and this is down at the bottom end or the outer end of the gun. the air is coming down this tube from the pressure washer and goes through the blast orifice inside here and accelerates that air as it goes through that blast orifice. And then we actually bring the grit in through this line from the metering point on the hopper, and with a small volume of air that is just propelling the grit into this, and then the grit is accelerated down this tube by the high-speed velocity of the blast coming out of the jet. And this is the part of the design that's probably different than any air compressor that you might buy at a local hardware store. It tends to provide us with a system that doesn't plug, that is kind of consistent, and gives us the performance that we think is will work for this kind of application. The lower diagram here shows, probably difficult to visualize, but the bottom of the hopper, there's a metering block under here. The students used a DC motor that they pulled out of a battery-powered cordless drill, and so there's a module that they printed out of plastic to house that motor, and it's connected up here. I've located better components that are more commercially viable for the two that I'm building for University of Minnesota. The orange hose you see here is the air that's coming to pick up the grit at the bottom of the metering point, and then it would go out the other side that you can't see here and follow this green hose in that clear tube up here and go out to the point where it would be entrained with the rest of the air at the application point. Then there's a wiring harness and several valves and hoses and to carry the grit in the air and pull it all together. I'm estimating that this subsystem, that if I were to build this subsystem based on the current design I have for the hopper, the metering system, the components that I have to put in that system, that a retail price for that would probably be in the neighborhood of $1,950. Somebody wanting to build a single gun experimental unit for their unit that they could use in a small operation or test could add their own air compressor to that, and their whatever platform, whether kind of a cart or if you wanted to mount it on a 3-point platform or whatever your choice would be, but you could build that system with the module and with an air source like a gas-powered compressor. And your cost would clearly be more than $1,950 because you have to buy that compressor. But this would the modular idea is that we can build a single gun system, or if somebody wants a 2-nozzle system for doing a row of crop behind a small tractor, they could buy 2 of those modules, put them back to back, run them with either a larger compressor or even potentially 2 compressors if you find one that is economical to add to the module, and run 2 nozzles. Or if you're looking for a larger machine to do, let's say 4 nozzles, you could buy a now turn to a screw compressor that is a much more durable and much more expensive compressor, but would give you the air you needed to run up to 4 of these modules. Let me go back. That's a CAD diagram of the basic module that I'm building now. Not everything is shown here. These are the components that I'm fabricating for the University of Minnesota systems. You have the hopper system itself, and this whole thing would fit on a platform. And this down here is the metering system, and what you're looking at the end of is the DC motor mount that's incorporated in there that will mount the drive motor on. There's also a trap door on the side here so that you can empty it, because you do need to empty this faithfully when you get done, or if you get any moisture in your grit, it'll bridge or form a block in there that's difficult to get out. So it needs to be emptied at the end of use or when you're finished with it for the day. The idea then was that for a single gun system, you could use one grit subsystem, add your compressor. The ones that I'm producing or I'm using right now would have a minimum of 9 cubic feet per minute at about 90 pounds per square inch, and then mount those both on a platform to accommodate the user, whatever you want to do with it. A 2-nozzle system, then you could use 2 of the grit subsystems and a larger compressor, or potentially 2 compressors. And then another thing that could be done here is you could replace that gun and mount the nozzles on I would call it like a belly bar underneath the tractor, so that you can observe where they are and drive along and point them at the base of the row that you want to apply the grit to for weeding. And then you'd switch out the control system, not a handheld valve like we have in this one, but you'd use a button switch on your steering wheel or on the side of the tractor to turn on and off the system when you want it on and off. And then if you're going to do a multiple nozzle system for 2 or more rows, you may be looking at you could use the same grid subsystem, but you might be looking at a rotary screw compressor for the large air demand that's required. I have my contact in here in case somebody's interested in exploring this further. I'm not, haven't actively sold the machines yet, but I am trying to do a design that would enable that if there's demand for them. I think that's probably the take-home message from Sam's presentation, and that's probably where you might want to finish.
Thank you, Dan. So the last thing I'll finish with is just a quick take-home message, and that is that abrasive weeding seems to be a good option when you have a high density of annual broadleaf weeds in the crop row that are already difficult to control. If you can apply those grits when weeds are ideally less than about an inch tall, it's very important to source or prepare inexpensive grit to maximize the profitability of this technique relative to hand weeding. Or if you're looking to apply fertilizer anyway, if you think back to that pepper study where we showed that you can manipulate yields and soil nitrogen with the use of organic fertilizers, if you need to side dress a fertilizer anyway, this might be a novel way to apply that fertilizer that provides some supplemental weed control as well. If you've got human labor issues, we'll call it that, in terms of sourcing, retaining, paying employees, and you're looking to mechanize or automate some of your on-farm operations, this might be a way to do that with some of your weed control. And then, as our analysis shows, as the value of that crop goes up, in addition to the amount of weed pressure, the profitability of this method really increases. And so that's where we're trying to target some of this future work. And Frank Forcella has a new project with collaborators at the University of Minnesota to look at the use of abrasive weeding in raspberries. And I saw a question in the Q&A box about whether or not this has been tested in orchards. And unfortunately, I knew I'd run long on time, which I already have, and I apologize. And so I couldn't include some of Frank's pictures in here of what they've done in raspberries so far. But in short, they're seeing some good weed control in raspberry systems, especially during those establishment years. And so, you know, raspberries, certainly orchard crops are going to be possibilities. Again, the one thing I'll caution is just that it's most effective on annual broadleaf weeds, to somewhat of a lesser extent grasses. And then, as we showed with quackgrass, we can control those perennial weeds, but it's a little bit different. We need repeated control, and the goal there is to exhaust those below ground energy reserves, as opposed to with annual broadleaves, we're trying to snap that stem or completely defoliate to take away the above ground meristematic growing points. Alice, can you advance the slide?
Oh, sure. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to wrap up with an acknowledgement. So thankful for the funding from National Institute of Food and Agriculture, the Organic Research and Extension Initiative. Collaborators, Alice and her team at eOrganic have been great to work with. Frank's with the ARS, South Dakota State University, friends still at University of Illinois. And then last slide, Alice. All right, well, yeah, that's all right. These pictures didn't show up, but basically this is just my project webpage where I have a list of publications and other information, including that extension article that Alice has referenced. So if you're interested in learning more about this project or some related research that we're working on here at Nebraska, this is my webpage, and so don't hesitate to reach out to me, and you also have Dan's contact info as well. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. I am going to put the link to that article and video up in just a moment, but I just want to leave Sam's website up here just for a few minutes in case there's anybody who wants to copy that down. So we're going to have probably about 15 minutes now for questions. So with that, I'm just going to move on to a couple of questions. We had one question here. It says, Bartlett are air spading biochar under urban and sick trees in the USA and the UK. Could that system be potentially adapted to do the same? I mean, could this abrasive weeding system be adapted to I guess, apply biochar as well?
Dan, I'll let you take that question.
Okay.
That sounds like an engineering question.
Well, I've had an inquiry from somebody who was interested in doing just that. This individual apparently makes biochar out of walnut shells and was interested in applying it he sells the biochar, I think, he said to organic producers as a long-term carbon source and soil amendment. And was interested when he read about this, about the possibility of using it as the grit and getting kind of the benefit of the soil amendment from the char, as well as killing weeds. Now, I don't know exactly whether that will come to commercial fruition or not, but if he wants to experiment with a machine, he might be able to find out if that's possible. I'm not sure how familiar he was with the abrasive grit concept, and may have been looking at it more as a broadcast application for his biochar product. But the more use you can get out of the grit, just like Sam had in here, if you can get fertility benefit out of the grit, that's great. If you can get some soil amendment benefit out of biochar and kill weeds at the same time, or damage weeds at the same time, there might be benefit to doing that.
Okay. For the pepper trial, what was the fertilization level in the weed-free treatment? Was it similar to the high or the low sustained treatment?
Yeah, so in all of those, the weed-free treatment didn't get any special fertility that the grit-treated plots did not. And so in theory, like we saw in the kale study, the added fertilizer grits we would have expected would increase the yields relative to that weed-free check, because there is additional fertility in theory from that sustained product. So the fact that we saw slightly lower yields in the grit-treated plots compared to the weed-free suggests that there's probably still some yield loss that's occurring because of the fact that we're not getting 100% weed suppression. I think some of the weeds that are being left behind are still incurring some yield loss. Now, we often get questions about damage to the crop, and we've looked at this in pretty close detail. And because we do get some short-term kind of, I guess, scarring of stem tissue, depending on how precise we are with the application of the grit. But we've done pathogen studies, and we haven't observed any increase in disease incidence from grit weeding. And we haven't, sometimes we get some differences in plant architecture. Sometimes the stem might bend away from the source of the grit. But we haven't really, in controlled studies, we haven't observed any reduction in yield as a result of just the grit application itself. So we suspect that any yield loss that's occurring is just because of the incomplete suppression of weeds.
Okay, I do have the link here in case you're interested to the article that Sam wrote with his colleagues, and the video is embedded in that article at this bottom link here. I would like to thank everyone, especially Sam and Daniel, for this very informative presentation on abrasive weeding, and we look forward to hearing any updates in the future. And thank you to everyone for joining us.